Okay, well, small is the new big in audiences as well, so that's fantastic. I agree with that. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Katz. And I'm delighted to be delivering another keynote speech for the b.TWEEN conference this year. I was really sorry, in fact, to miss yesterday's session, and particularly Angel's address on strategic serendipity. I would love to have heard her story. Apart from her glamazon picture and fabulous name, I was really daunted by her entry on the conference blog describing how, by chance, while playing volleyball with a bunch of rocket scientists on Capitol Hill, where I was practicing law, I met some entrepreneurs. Well, that's a pretty daunting piece of content from a bio. She's probably also seen attack ships on fire off the coast of Orion and sea beams glittering in the dark at the Tannhauser Gate, I'm sure, but, as we all have, I'm sure. But anyway, Angel is a very hard act to follow, especially after a very hot news item like Bebo and iTunes yesterday, as indeed are all the other panelists and participants you met yesterday, especially as you're all digital evangelists and technology entrepreneurs, and my own relationship with technology is distinctly unusual, I think is quite unusual, because technology has been a really big part of my life, a very influential part of my career. But I'm not a natural, I'm not a geek. I love it, but I've had to learn it. In fact, a lot of it I haven't learned, but I do use it a lot. So it's probably not the same relationship as many of you will have with it. In fact, my view of technology is that it's a bit like riding a horse. If you let it know you're scared of it, it's really going to play up. So I really try not to let technology think I'm scared of it, even though I am. And what's more, I'm always baffled. I don't know if any of you have ever considered this. You're probably too technologically savvy to consider this. But how is it that no matter how fantastically avant-garde the piece of software we're working with, or how dazzling the piece of kit is we're working with, the way to sort of fix it if anything goes wrong is simply to pull out the plug in the wall? How can this be? How can technology be reduced to, all this wonderful stuff we see and complete with, be reduced to just having to take the battery out and put it back in again, or pull out the plug in the wall and plug it back in? That just seems so weird to me. So I think probably not to you, and I do know the difference between hardware and software, but that's the kind of thing that I think about when I think about technology that's kind of intractable. So I have no breaking news today, and I'm not nearly as tech-savvy as all of you. So I'm taking advantage of the only card I've got here in this event, and that is my age. After all, I was born, well, some of you probably my age, but probably not many. I was born into an era where television was a set. We called it the television set. The web was a spider's house. Pong was the only game in town, and advertising was then, believe me, an aspirational career. Which means, to quote Philip K. Dick again, I've seen some things you people wouldn't believe. So the title of my talk is From the First to the Third Wave, which was really only meant to be a working title, but sadly I didn't actually work at it any further, so it ended up being like a rather crap title. I'm sorry about that. But it does reflect my ability to take, or my requirement, my mandate to take a long view, having been involved quite heavily, quite pivotally actually, in certainly the first wave, and now I think heavily involved in the third wave, to offer a view from the perspective of having been there. So I think people usually talk about this being the second boom. I would actually say it's the third. If you think about IT in general, you might say there's 4 and 5, but largely there's been 3. 3 waves of change. Perhaps we've experienced them as evolutionary, but they've clearly been fueled by 3 revolutionary technologies. I think the first wave was the original information technology revolution in Silicon Valley in the 80s, the birth of the personal computing industry and the genesis of Apple and Microsoft, the decline of IBM as a computing superpower, the rise of the PC clones, all of that. This was a revolution in the very real sense, in that it was about the democratization or redistribution of computing power from the mainframe to the desktop. So that was a very real revolution, and actually nothing that happens now would have happened if that revolution hadn't happened. And the second wave, I think, was the opening up of the World Wide Web in the 90s, the genesis of Amazon and eBay, the rise of Google and search, and the transfer of the world's information and knowledge over to online. This was an information revolution, and although the web was a connective sphere, its primary benefit in that first wave, second wave altogether, was one of access. So now we could access just about everything. This new wave, this third wave, some would say this is the tidal wave that will sweep all before it, is all about convergent platforms and technologies, the fast penetration of broadband which facilitates the digital on-demand media age, the burgeoning of user-generated content and user control, the continued phenomenon of Google, and the rise without trace of social networks like MySpace, YouTube and Facebook. This is a revolution of real significance, I think, as the first one was, because it's a revolution of connectivity, control, content, and I think now it's starting to be a revolution of creativity. And I'm involved now in all of these three pivotal points in different ways and different perspectives. And what's certainly true to me, and that is a long view, 3 decades, is that big themes do seem to emerge as you approach the third wave and you approach your 5th decade of life in relation to technology, human nature, and the media business. In fact, the same themes emerge in relation to everything in life. One finds life, loss, love, death, and somewhere in the middle is art. And that just about covers everything that happens, and that is a metaphor for almost everything that happens. And what are the big truths with the benefit of a surfeit of hindsight in my case? I'd say the big truths are: stuff changes but people don't. Communication is everything. And while history really does repeat itself, progress is possible. And I think that, by the way, is quite a utopian view. And there's lots of other things that one could say, but if you had to distill it down, I think those are the big truths that I would see from here. So I thought I'd weave a narrative today from my personal journey around some of those big themes and truths as they relate to the really exciting world that we find ourselves in now, that what this conference is about. We are today creators, producers, inventors, and communicators. How does that all work for us? I'm actually going to start with my story from the second wave. In the euphoria of the first dot-com boom around 1995, I was invited to address Rupert Murdoch's News Group annual conference in Australia. If you remember, that was in the context of very overheated predictions about the imminent death of old media and the demise of the old model of advertising that supports it. So that was good. I was going to Australia. That was very good. I had a 3-week holiday planned around that. This was the old days of advertising. Anyway, I went to this thing literally in the height of the dot-com boom, or just as it was starting. So there was not a rumour of any problem. And against the grain, which is not what people expected one to do in that moment, but I pretty much against the grain delivered a curmudgeon's manifesto to that group. It was about 300 people. All old media barons, or press people and television people in Australia. And I called the speech Crystal Bollocks, which they put in a big screen behind me. So it went out on the 6 o'clock news or something, and my mother saw it. She said, "How could you say bollocks? That's not on television." But anyway, it was perhaps not the most dignified of things, but it was memorable for me at least. And I made that speech not because I was pandering to what these guys wanted to hear at all, but because I genuinely believed the assumptions that were being made at the time about how people would behave in the online world based on what we knew then were simply wrong. I thought the assumptions were wrong. I'd spent a career observing people close up in relation to how they form impressions and choices, how they consume and relate to ideas, content and communication of all kinds. It seemed to me that the condemnation of human beings to being solipsistic fat controllers leaning forward to consume a totally predetermined media menu, engaging only with pre-filtered information and content on demand, that was the wrong picture from a humanistic and sociological perspective. The death of broadcast and the disempowerment of brands, institutions and organisations was at least premature and ultimately unlikely, even though the terms of people's relationships with them would obviously change. I felt that people were wrong at the time as well about how brands work and what brands are for. Adam Smith said the function of wealth is the display of wealth, and this is a parallel function of brands, display. People, I ranted at the time, do not only, ever and forever want to consume the daily me. Serendipity, discovery and surprise are as valuable as predictability, familiarity and affinity. If humans in general did not want to expand their horizons, we'd still be living in caves. People do not always want to interact. They do not always want to be leaning forward. Entertainment is often happily consumed passively.